Thank you all for being here today. So today we're going to be talking about evaluation for funded teaching and learning projects. So you might be someone who holds a TLEF or an SaP or an OER. We're going to get a sense of who's in the room in just a second here. But Trish and I are both research and evaluation consultants with the research and evaluation team at the Center for Teaching and Learning. And it is our job to help with evaluation of all of these different funded projects through the various grants here at UBC. So before we get started, I'd like to just do a quick land acknowledgement. So I'd like to honor the First Peoples from the land where I'm sharing with you today by acknowledging that I'm here on the land of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations in this place that is today known as Vancouver and Kitsilano. And I would encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you are situated on. Trish has kindly posted in the chat. If you have not looked at this website before, it provides a great overview of kind of the different territories and the owners of the land that we are all situated on in various ways. So yeah, would encourage you to take a moment to reflect on that. And then just to give us a quick overview of today's session. So we'll be going through kind of the evaluation cycle. We'll have a series of activities. We anticipate this to be a fairly interactive workshop. Don't worry, we won't be putting you into breakout rooms or anything like that, but there will be a worksheet, which you are very welcome to follow along with. We would encourage you to use that worksheet throughout the workshop to help you kind of define different pieces of your project. And we hope to leave you with kind of tangible steps and tangible ways to move forward with your evaluation plan for your funded project. And then we'll go through a few additional pieces, kind of extra considerations, measures and approaches. And then we will have a few folks join us close to the end who are current TLEF holders who will tell us a little bit about their experiences with TLEF evaluation in particular. So just as we get started here, we'd love to get a sense of who is in the room. So we've got a quick poll here for you. So if you don't mind just letting us know if you currently hold a grant, if you don't know what's going on with all of these different acronyms, we'd love to know who's in the room. Fantastic. So it seems like the majority of the folks are current TLEF holders. We've got a couple of SaP fund holders, no one from the OER fund, and a couple people who are working on applications. So thank you for sharing that with us. Just one note, if you are an SaP fund holder, if you don't mind just sending me a private message in the chat, the folks who run the SaP were just curious to know who was part of this workshop, and then if they wanted to send slides to other folks just to make sure they're not double dipping. So yeah, great. Thank you for letting us know. It's always helpful to just get a sense of where folks are and yeah, what they're working on. So thank you for letting us know. So jumping right into the content pieces now of our workshop today. The first question, kind of what we always start out with, is what is the point of evaluation? Why do we encourage evaluation? Why is this a necessary component of all of these different grants and funds here at UBC? So evaluation really is about making sure that your project outcomes are met and that your plan is working as intended. So when we suggest a new resource, a new set of modules, creating a new classroom learning activity, whatever it is that you're proposing as part of your teaching and learning project, evaluation is really about making sure that what you hope is happening is actually happening, and having concrete evidence to back up the claims that you're making about the impacts that your project is having. So evaluation can help you figure out if the goals that you have for your project are actually being met, whether things are working out the way that you anticipate, whether things are translating to the students the way that you're hoping that they are, to the project team the way that you hope they are. Evaluation can also help you improve the design of your project and then also implementation in a kind of nice iterative manner. So we'll get a little bit into that when we talk about our cycle, but we really think about evaluation as an iterative process where each round you learn more information. You really think about evaluation as feedback. So each time you seek input, seek feedback, do something that is evaluation, hopefully you can then incorporate that back into the design and the implementation the next time you do it in a new and better way, and then just learn cyclically as you continue to do that. And finally, evaluation also can help you make informed decisions. So if there are particular things that aren't working, particular things that are working really well, it can help you figure out how to kind of maximize the impact that you're having, remove things that aren't working, improve things that might just need a little small tweak to really be effective. And then a final point is that it is also a required component of these projects, but hopefully through our chatting about it today, we'll be able to convince you that that's a good and important and useful thing. So moving into our evaluation cycle, so you might kind of identify this as also fairly close to the research cycle, but we really do think about evaluation as this iterative process in which we typically kind of start at the top with the questions that we might have, looking through kind of methodology, identifying sources of data, collecting that data, disseminating what it is that we found, and kind of the critical piece for teaching and learning projects in particular is modifying the pedagogy and really taking what you've learned and applying that into your teaching practice, into your curriculum design, into whatever it is that is necessary. And then going through multiple rounds over multiple semesters or multiple years of really tweaking and improving and getting feedback repeatedly. So we've got another quick poll here, just so that we can kind of get a sense of what stage folks are at. So if you haven't yet gotten started, you can kind of tell us that you're closer to the defining question stage, but it's just helpful to get a sense of where people are. We will probably spend the majority of today's workshop kind of going through the first two pieces. So regardless of where you are, hopefully that's helpful in your next round as you're kind of moving forward and thinking through this. And hopefully for those of us who are in those first couple of stages, we can leave you with some really concrete ways to move forward with that piece. So let's jump right in and get started with defining questions. So we're going to talk about kind of the practice piece. So what is it that you're building out, and then the intended impacts. What do you hope that this thing that you're building out as part of your project is going to have? So to get started here, we're going to jump right in with that worksheet. So I would encourage you to pull up that worksheet. I'm going to provide us with kind of an example here, and then we'll take a few minutes and go through and do it for our own projects. So you already know what your kind of classroom context is, you know what your practice and your resource is. We're not going to, spend time brainstorming those here. We're not starting from scratch. You've already proposed a project. You already know what it is that you want to do and why it's important and what you hope it will accomplish in your classroom. But the goal here really is it's helpful to spell out exactly what that practice is and who you hope it will be accessed by, the context in which you hope it will be used, how you hope it will be improving or changing the experiences that folks are having. So the first page of that worksheet really has kind of information on the background and the context of your class. We're not going to spend too much time working on that in this workshop, but we would encourage you to take some time to think about how your classroom context or your course context might impact the ways that you think about evaluation, both kind of from a logistical, practical standpoint, and then also how that might impact the types of impacts you hope you're having. So moving into our first activity, you'll notice we've got a list here of kind of the types of practices or resources that we most commonly see. These are also on that worksheet that Trish has posted into the chat for us. So we're going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes here. We would invite you to open the worksheets and then look under kind of that activity 1 section and really think about which of these kind of different areas your practice or resource might fall. So it's likely that it's more than one, but thinking through kind of what these different pieces are and how they might be relevant to your project. So determining the practice is really necessary for them being able to construct useful evaluation questions for situating the context for your evaluation. So take a couple minutes and do that in the worksheet. And then we would also encourage you to do that on the slide here. So you can use the annotate tool. So if you go under view options at the top of your screen, you'll see the little annotate button. And we would encourage you to put a check mark or a star or whatever else kind of in this column to the right to let us know where your practice and resources fall. Great. So I think we've had a couple minutes here. Hopefully you've had a chance to also reflect on that in the worksheet. So we do have quite a spread here, which isn't surprising. So typically we do see kind of these are the top 10, I guess, practices and resources we tend to see with TLEF, SaP, and OER projects. And like I mentioned, and like is reflected here, most people kind of fall in a number of these different categories. But it is really just helpful to identify for ourselves what it is that our practice or resource is, and it can bring up great questions about opening it up or not opening it up, or like it can help us reflect on different pieces and actually maybe even help us think about adding or tweaking different components or pieces that we hadn't thought about before that might actually be relevant to the project that we might want to consider evaluating. So once we figured out what it is that we're trying to build out, what it is that we're trying to do, what the novel thing is that we're doing, the next goal really is to define the impact. So the impact being, what effect do you hope this will have? As all of us approach teaching and learning projects, we've identified some sort of problem or some sort of area for improvement or something that we're excited to implement, something novel and cool in our teaching. And so the goal really is here to take a moment to reflect on, okay, what exactly is it that I want this thing to accomplish? Do I want it to increase student learning, student engagement, student well-being? Are there different pieces that I might think about as the intended impacts that I'm hoping my work will have? So we have a couple of examples here. For example, if your project is more kind of curriculum design based, maybe you're replacing lectures throughout the term with some sort of tutorial. And maybe the goal here is to increase student engagement using a more active learning method, and also increase some sort of sense of belonging or community by encouraging students to do group work. You might take a moment here to reflect on your own practice or resource and then think about the intended impact that it's having. And then we'll do kind of the same thing again, where we'll have a slide with the list and we'll ask you to reflect for yourself and then also to identify your impacts. And so here, you may have thought about a couple of these different pieces, particularly if you consulted with us, or different pieces that you might have thought about as you wrote your application. But we would encourage you here to think about whether there might be some other pieces that might be relevant, because then again, that is something you can think about approaching in your evaluation. So again, I'll give us a couple of minutes here if you want to just work through the worksheet and then indicate here in the right-hand column, again, using the stamp or the annotate tool, which of these impacts you're hoping that your practice or resource will have. Great. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for indicating through here. So we can see that one single project might have a number of different desired or intended impacts. We might be looking at something that, we want to improve student learning, but we also want to improve engagement or motivation or a sense of belonging or community. We might want to ensure that our everything that we're building out is inclusive, following UDL principles or more accessible to a number of different learners. Lots of different pieces that you might think about. And again, looking at this list, you might realize that there are pieces that you kind of hoped would be intended impacts that you might not have necessarily identified ahead of time. And it's useful to just take a few minutes and reflect on what these different pieces might be, because they will help you build out your evaluation questions. So we've got a lot of folks here looking at learning and knowledge, engagement, strategic areas, inclusive design, student exposures to different ways of learning, a great spread of lots of different cool projects happening around campus. So that's always great to see. So thank you for sharing that with us. So from here, we're going to move into the next piece, which is now that we've identified our practices, resources, and intended impacts, what are the questions that we're looking to answer? So what are the guiding questions that we want to take us into this process of evaluation? The questions kind of involve your intended outcomes, and so the answer will become the claim that you make about your project success. So thinking really carefully about what the questions are that you want to ask, because they will then allow you to say, this is how my project was effective, this is how my practice or resource had an impact on the students, the project team, the teaching team, etc. So we would encourage you here to take a couple of minutes to think about one primary evaluation question. Thinking about each of those different impacts, you might have 3 or 4 evaluation questions addressing each of those different pieces. So for example, here under the second example, we've got developing an open self-study quiz database, and we're looking at wanting to increase student learning as well as resource accessibility. And we might ask 2 different evaluation questions to get at each of those different intended impacts. So again, we'll take a couple of minutes here to really articulate those evaluation questions. And then when you have something in mind, we would encourage you to share it in the chat. And please feel free to comment on other people's evaluation questions. Feel free to ask questions or clarification. The feedback might actually help us whittle down our evaluation questions into something more concise. Great. So thank you to those who shared their questions. So there's some great questions here in the chat. So thinking about different pieces of student impact, thinking about student confidence levels, thinking about how prepared students feel for different practicum experiences. So these are great starts to evaluation questions. Attitudes and capacity to report. Great. So some really cool sounding projects happening here. I always love hearing about different projects that are happening around campus. There's just so many different approaches being taken, so many different intended impacts, and it's really cool to see all of these different questions coming out. So these are great starting point questions. Fantastic, kind of located in your context, thinking about particularly how something that you're doing, something that you're building out is having a particular impact. Great, thank you for sharing those. We would encourage you to continue developing those, continue kind of editing them down, thinking about what it is really that you want to get to the heart of, and kind of thinking about prioritizing them as well. Part of something that can happen that we do see happen sometimes is if we do have a list of 6 or 7 intended impacts, getting bogged down in having too many questions. It is great to have a number of different impacts and a number of different questions. We would always encourage you to kind of think about priority and kind of what your top 2 to 3 questions would be, and focus on those. And then if you have the time or capacity, if it works nicely in the methods you've chosen, kind of how you can integrate those other questions in as well. So we'll move forward into the second piece of our evaluation cycle here, and I'll get us started and then turn it over to Trish. So once we've got our questions, we figured out what it is that we're hoping to do. The next question is how and where are we going to find evidence of these? How are we going to answer these questions that we have essentially? And so the goal here is identifying sources and methods. So sources of data and methods that you might be able to use. So again, we've got this paralleled on the worksheet. So we would encourage you to then think about taking your evaluation questions and thinking about what measures or methods you might use. So we're going to stop doing this as activities now, and we're going to encourage you to kind of take some of these and move forward after the workshop and do some reflection and work through some of these pieces. So the measures here, the goal is kind of to think about what could help you find answers, what could help you indicate that a change has actually occurred, that an improvement has actually taken place. And then the methods are, how are you going to do that? So where are you going to look to find evidence? What are the data sources that you're going to use? What kind of approach are you going to take to trying to find the answers to those questions? So here our example might be thinking about how those self-study quizzes might impact student learning, student knowledge. We might think of kind of both performance and confidence as two of the measures that we might be thinking of. So what might help us find answers? What are the kinds of things we want to look at? And then the methods we might use in order to do that might be looking at student performance on quizzes and then measuring student confidence and students' perception of knowledge as well through things like surveys or focus groups. So we'll touch briefly on some common evaluation methods. This is a bit of an unwieldy chart, but I'm just going to direct your attention to different pieces of it. So this is kind of taken from a survey of methods within the field of the scholarship of teaching and learning. Of the most common kinds of methods that are typically employed. And so here on the left, in that left-hand column, you'll see a number of different data collection instruments, a number of different methods that are often employed. And the goal of kind of highlighting this is we want you to be aware of there are kind of the most common evaluation methods, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about those three. But there are a number of different ways you can think about approaching evaluation, a number of different data sources and things that might be interesting to look at. We just would encourage you to think about what it is that you want to measure before you come up with a tool or a particular method. So particularly just because something is familiar to you or something that is frequently used in your discipline doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best option for a teaching and learning project. So the goal here really is to consider what's best for your evaluation question. We often see folks kind of on the more quantitative side tend towards the more quantitative methods, and on the qualitative side tend towards the more qualitative methods. We would always encourage you to think about the tool that is best aligned with the question, to jump out of your comfort zone a little bit, and also to know that you have a lot of support from Trish and myself and our research and evaluation team, as well as other folks in your department, other folks around the university to help support you in using methodologies that you might not be completely familiar or comfortable with. So there is lots of support kind of from our end to make sure that it happens well, but we would encourage you to think about how to best get at the answer to the question that you're trying to answer. So from here, we'll talk about those kind of three most common evaluation methods. Those are the ones that we see the most often. And I'm going to pass it over to Trish here to take us through the other half of the workshop. So thank you, Trish.
Thanks, Natasha. So yeah, as Natasha said earlier, and what was on the last slide, is that there are many different techniques that you can use, and we encourage that type of broad thinking. We're going to talk just briefly about the three common ones that we tend to see in evaluation, teaching and learning evaluation projects, which are interviews, focus groups, and surveys. Again, we're just going to spend a few minutes on each of these because they are the ones that most commonly get used. But really, as Natasha said, the most important thing is choose something that reflects the questions that you're asking, the context that you're in. So, classroom observations, narrative approaches, doing an analysis of something that the students produce as part of the classroom activities. There are so many different ways that you can approach evaluation. It doesn't have to be one of these three, but they are the ones that we see the most commonly. So we just wanted to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about those. So first I'll talk a little bit about interviews and focus groups, and just kind of sort of the benefits behind them in the cases in which you might want to consider using them. So with interviews and focus groups, they really give you a more detailed understanding of the experience. So you're able to drill down on a handful of students and what their experience was with whatever the activity or new resource or tool or approach that you implemented. Again, I just want to clarify, we talk a lot about students and the classroom as our main examples, but we want to recognize that you might be working with TAs or you might be working with community partners outside of the classroom or in different contexts. So I know we typically use students in classrooms, but I just want to acknowledge that you might be working in a different context, and that's absolutely fine. Obviously, these would translate to those settings as well. So yeah, just if you're getting hung up on like, oh, she keeps saying classrooms, but I'm not doing this in a classroom, likely this would still relate to your setting. Just, yeah, in the context of students, if you did something like a focus group, you're able to get more of kind of a narrative approach and getting feedback that moves beyond what typically is what you get in a survey, which is more qualitative in nature. So you're really able to dig down into what was happening in their experience. With focus groups, they're better suited than interviews for eliciting discussions and getting those at those social interactions. So, for example, if I was conducting an interview with Natasha and a few other of you in this setting, and I was asking about how you felt about this workshop, Natasha might say something like, oh, I felt like it was a little bit long. I wanted to do more activities or work through more examples. And one or two of you might chime in and say, yeah, actually, I hadn't really thought about how examples might be useful, but I could see how doing X, Y, and Z would have helped me better understand blah, blah, blah. So it gives students a chance to kind of feed off of each other. And that does not always meaning just to agree with them. It could also be to disagree with them. So someone might say, actually, Natasha, I didn't feel that way. Or they're speaking to me, actually, Trish, I felt like there were enough examples. I was happy just to sit back and listen to you to the hammer on. That was my preferred approach. So it just provides an opportunity for people to bring up things that they might not organically. And that's sort of kind of the counter side to interviews, is that you get a more detailed one-on-one setting, but it really relies on that participant to recall information. And there might be specific points that they stick on that if there was someone else there, they might have something to say about an element that they didn't recall on their own. Kind of sitting in the middle between focus groups and interviews is the idea of paired interviews. And so that's where you have your participants, your students, basically interview each other. So it's a way that you kind of get rid of a bit of that power dynamic that comes with having an external interviewer. And it sort of becomes a conversation between the two people where they can, again, feed off of each other, but it's in a smaller context. So where focus groups, we usually recommend somewhere between 4 to 7 people. Interviews can be better for things like sensitive topics. So if you're talking about certain diversity issues or issues related to equity deserving groups, there might be cases where it makes more sense to have a one-on-one conversation where someone who's in a group setting might not feel comfortable bringing their voice out or sharing their experiences. And it really helps to draw out that individual voice. In focus groups, but sometimes the case is, you'll have 1 or 2 dominant speakers and a few people who aren't as keen to bring their voices out. We have a whole separate workshop on running focus groups and interviews. And we talk a little bit in that one about how to try to pull out those voices. But there are some cases and some topics where it really does just make more sense to do an interview. And so in those cases, that would be the preferred method over focus groups. Just thinking about some tips, if this is the route you're taking and the method that you're choosing, to make sure that you have a detailed thought out protocol. So before going into the interview or the focus group, think about what are the main questions that you want to ask. Again, really limiting these to maybe 5 or 6 questions with the expectation that there might be sort of follow-up questions about those that you might have, or a topic that kind of branches off based on what the participants are really passionate about, but also helps to make sure that, okay, any discussion that we have is going to help answer my evaluation questions, and that you're not just having it. You can get a lot of great feedback by just having a casual conversation. But ultimately, you're making use of these people's time, and you want to respect that to get the information that you need. So it's not just, oh, I did this whole interview, but I actually didn't learn anything about how they felt about these new modules that I created, and now I need to run another interview to do that. So really having a setup in advance so that you know that you can follow the prompts that you've set up for yourself. Make sure that you learn how to facilitate discussions. As I mentioned, we do have another workshop that we ran. I think we ran one recently, if I'm correct, Natasha. Maybe Natasha can share the link to that workshop in our chat as well, so people can look over that. So just thinking about how, again, you might have those speakers who don't feel as comfortable, or the dominant few get kind of the focus, the spotlight on them. Ways to help facilitate that discussion and make sure, again, that you're getting the questions answered that you want answered. And finally, really encourage you to record the session, again, making sure that you get permission and consent from your participants, because you won't remember all of the nuances of a conversation or the details that happened in that session. Next, talking about surveys. Surveys are great because they can help you reach many participants in a shorter period of time. So you can embed something like this into a classroom practice or some kind of activity or assignment, which allows you to reach a larger number of people, potentially the whole class. It's unlikely that your entire class will participate in the survey, even if you give them dedicated time in class. And it's only a few questions. There will always be people who can't be bothered, but it does give you a much broader reach. It might also be easier to connect with broader groups that you might have trouble setting up a focus group or an interview with otherwise. So thinking about things like students who are doing some kind of remote practicum, or community partners or alumni. Those can be people that are harder to sort of track down and commit some time to, where sending them a survey is something that they can do on their own time. As I mentioned, it's easier to integrate it into an activity or an assignment. What we see sometimes is if the evaluation is around perhaps a certain assignment that has been newly designed, tagging on a couple survey questions at the end that asks them to reflect on their experience, you can really kind of make it seem like it's part of the assignment itself, and that helps elicit more feedback. It's also relatively inexpensive in terms of time and cost to administer compared to focus groups and interviews. We also have a whole workshop on survey design. I believe Natasha posted a link to that session in the chat. So it's not to say that surveys are easier to do, but they don't require all the same amount of time commitment in terms of, you're sitting in a room with participants for, an hour over multiple sessions. Focus groups and interviews tend to take a lot more time in terms of any type of transcribing you need to do or coding, tends to be more time intensive than with surveys. Some tips for surveys is to keep it short. Really, any survey that you implement should not take anyone longer than 10 to 15 minutes. Anything beyond that, you're really likely to not see people filling it out. So again, really focusing on the questions that will help you answer your evaluation goals. So thinking about, for each question that you're asking, what will this teach me? What will I learn from this about this activity, this module, this assignment, whatnot. Pilot your questions beforehand. And what we mean by this is have a colleague or a coworker or Natasha or I read through your questions, because your results can be highly dependent on the wording of items. You might be using a term that feels really familiar because it's within your discipline, and you might expect that your students would know what it means, but they might not. Again, these are details that we go into in our survey design workshop, but thinking about things like double-barreled questions where you're asking about two different elements within one question. And so students or your respondents might, agree with one part of the statement, but, really not agree with the other part. And it makes it hard to understand what their response means. So just having someone read over your survey and kind of go through it question by question will help ensure that you're going to be getting answers that are actually meaningful. It also helps give you a sense of how long it will take them to fill out the survey, and kind of help you, again, if you say, this is the goal of this survey, and I go through the questions and say, I'm not sure how this question relates to that, or, you said that you really wanted to know about their motivation, but you don't actually have any questions that are explicitly about motivation. So having someone else look through it, just kind of a third person that's outside of, you're seeing the big picture and all the complicated pieces. So someone else can really see what the questions are really asking and whether it's clear for someone who's outside of the context. Make sure that you use a FIPA compliant tool. FIPA is Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. At UBC, we use Qualtrics. That's our designated cool tool that is FIPA compliant. I'm battling a bit of a head cold, so I apologize if I seem a little fuzzy or I'm repeating myself too much. One other point that we want to touch on is the idea of using mixed methods. So this gives you a much more holistic look at the data. So this would be the case where you include both quantitative and qualitative. And so in the examples that we provided, what you might do is ask some questions in a survey and then follow up with a focus group to really home in on, or get more detailed information about a specific experience that you're finding students are having. It gives you a much richer sample of information, and you kind of are able to just display or present the more nuanced pieces, as well as sort of that people kind of like looking at that overall statistic, like 66% of people agreed with blah, blah, blah. So in this example, this is sort of just how you could imagine presenting this type of data is, so you would have this at the top, this Likert item that students or participants responded on, where they agree or disagree with the statement. And then you have these direct quotes that you might have pulled from a focus group or interview, where you get a little bit more feedback about, why did they like it? What was it about it that they liked? Yeah, so in the example I said about doing a survey and then doing a focus group, you could also do the opposite. If you start off with something like interviews and you find, okay, consistently people are bringing up this point, but I want to see if that generalizes to the class at large, picking out a handful of people can give you really rich information, but you might say, like, okay, a lot of people brought up this point about, finding X activity kind of confusing. I'm going to run a survey with a question specifically targeted around that, and perhaps some other more general questions related to my evaluation. And so then you can pull out the experience of the class at large. Also, I just wanted to share this really nice quote from Bernstein, which they shared kind of their experience in doing different types of evaluation techniques. And someone responded back to them saying, I found your statistical evidence to be convincing, but your stories to be compelling. And doing a mixed methods approach really gets at that. So you're able to, have that strong statistical piece if you're providing some type of quantitative element to your evaluation plan, but then also, the stories, the voices of your participants as well is really great to include. Okay, so next we're going to move on to collecting and analyzing data, and just touching on a few points related to this. I'm just going to pause for a moment to see if anyone has any questions about methods or anything that we've brought up so far. Feel free to raise your hand or type something in the chat if you'd like to discuss. Okay, in that case, we will move on. So again, we're not going to spend too much time on these next couple sections because they really rely on you having collected your data and kind of moving forward. So collecting and analyzing your data will depend on the method that you've chosen for collecting data, but there are some things that you want to consider. So building out an action plan is a very helpful recommended thing that we do. The worksheet that we've provided has a bit of an action plan that you can use that includes timeline and milestones. So really thinking about for each stage of your evaluation, who is responsible for doing what types of things do you need, and how will you know that you've kind of concluded that element, or that achievement has been made. So if you decide, okay, for the project that I'm doing, I really want to do some online interviews with a handful of students from my class. Okay, who's going to design those questions? Who's going to facilitate the interview? Who's going to reach out to the students to recruit them for participation? So those are all kind of planning elements that are beyond just, I'm going to do some interviews. There are other pieces that you need to consider in terms of things that you need. If you're doing online interviews, thinking about a consent form that you need to share with students in advance, making sure that you are able to record the session, if there's any type of incentive that you're providing or remuneration for participating. So say you want to give them gift cards or something like that. So sort of those pieces. And then how will you know if that milestone has been met? So if you say, okay, I'm going to do interviews, and then you interview 4 students, did you get the data from those 4 students that you needed to answer your evaluation questions? Do you need to consider another approach or another method to be included as well? So your action plan can really help you set out things. Also in terms of timeline, if you need to collect your data by X date, or the course ends at X date and you need the data before the end of it, you're able to work backwards to kind of figure out, okay, at what point do I need to have my questions finalized? At what point do I need to start recruiting students to participate? It helps you build out all of those pieces. Other considerations, and these are for any type of method that you're choosing to use. Some common fallacies are that just because you understand something doesn't mean that your participants understand it. As I brought up earlier, doing a pilot with the questions that you're planning to ask it really helps to reduce any jargon that you're using or identify confusing items such as questions that might be double-barreled. Just making sure that people understand the questions that you're asking and that the answers that you're getting will help you understand your evaluation or understand the evaluation approach. Just because something is interesting doesn't make it an evaluation question. So make sure that you're not including extra questions that are kind of just there. It'd be nice to know how they felt about blah, blah, blah. Really focusing your questions based on what your overall evaluation question is. So looking at things like considering relevance. So do you really need to include this item? Looking at specificity, how you'll analyze each item that you choose to collect. So if you include, for example, a whole bunch of demographic information, but you really don't have a need to collect that information, you're not planning on doing any type of statistical analysis that is looking at splitting the data in those ways, it's probably not beneficial to include those items. And then also considering inclusion. So how can you make sure that the items are inclusive so that everyone feels like their voice is being heard, and that they're able to share their responses as genuinely as they can. We have a link on this page for some how-to guides. We have a short resource that we put together around inclusive data collection and some considerations for deciding whether questions that you want to ask specifically around more sensitive topics are actually relevant to your research goals or not. Okay, a few more considerations. So thinking about how to integrate evaluation into the course. So thinking about things like the timing, the flow, the cost to administer evaluation, cost thinking not just about giving out gift cards or some kind of incentive, but also the timely cost. So for whoever's helping you with your evaluation, the amount of time it'll take to run the focus groups or to design the survey questions. If you're integrating into your course, thinking about things like not interviewing students 3 months after the course is done because they might not really remember all the details of the experience that they had. Thinking about things also like timing of the interviews or focus group surveys, whatever it may be. Not doing them right before a midterm or right after a midterm, where students are maybe a little bit frazzled and don't have as much time or capacity to share their responses. Also thinking about whether you need BREV approval. So again, we have a whole separate workshop just around figuring out this question and deciding whether your question falls under the category of research, which is how UBC's BREV office determines if you need to get research ethics approval or not. And really thinking about even if your project doesn't require BREV approval, making sure that you're ethical in the practices that are involved in your evaluation. So making sure that you're asking students for consent before including any of their data in your analyses. Being mindful of things like students who choose not to participate, thinking about power dynamics and how that might influence who chooses to participate or not and how they respond. So there are a number of resources that Natasha shared in the chat, both around determining whether you need to go through the BREV approval process, and then also just thinking about ethical behavior at large. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about sharing your findings and kind of what it can look like to share your findings and how you might want to talk about sharing these. We won't really get into modifying pedagogy. That's sort of the last piece of, once you've gotten some data, how you move on from it and what changes you make to your practice or your resources or whatever it may be. As Natasha said earlier, evaluation is really an iterative process. So you do some focus groups, you find out that students, really didn't like one aspect of the course, or that, those self-study quizzes were actually, not as helpful as you thought them to be. So you make some modifications and you go through this process again, get feedback on all of the changes that you make. I saw someone had raised their hand. Someone have a question?
Yeah, it was me, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is great. I just had a quick question around evaluation and BREV, I should say, not. So I'm doing a project that involves community members in the downtown east side, peer journalists and UBC journalists. So I'm wondering, in terms of going through BREV, it'll mainly be like they're doing workshops. We'll be observing in the workshops, talking with people about their experiences. And so just sort of for the evaluation component of it, what you would kind of suggest, I guess.
Yeah. So the BREV approval and that whole process is quite complicated. And one of the links that Natasha shared has a checklist for helping you determine whether your project falls under more of that research component or more strictly evaluation. So that's sort of the first decision to make in terms of whether you follow through on applying for BREV approval or not. Thinking about it simply from an evaluation approach, what I would recommend is still using it like a short consent form. We actually have some examples on our website that really just let people know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so regardless of whether you go the research route and seek BREV approval, it's always a helpful and a strongly recommended thing to do is let whoever's participating know, how will their data be used? How will it be kept confidential or anonymous, or how will it be anonymized, or whatever the case may be. And even things like contact, if they want to follow up and say like, hey, you interviewed me, or you monitored me doing this workshop. What did you learn? What were the outcomes? So that's what I would really recommend. Not knowing too much about your project, that would be something that I would consider in that context.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Any other questions about anything I've talked about so far before we move on? Okay. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about this idea of sharing your findings. So this is a piece that what we're talking about here is really about the closure reports. So for TLEF, OER, and SaP projects, you'll be asked to do a closure report at the completion of your project, where you talk about your evaluation plan and the impacts. So thinking about how you're going to answer these questions is really helpful. And thinking about how you'll talk about them, and using the evaluation questions that you build out or have built out as part of that closure will really help you share what you've learned in a way that's meaningful. So we're just going to go through a few examples here, some that have been modified from closure reports that we've actually received. And so here is an example that we would not recommend. So if you simply write something like, we conducted surveys to determine student satisfaction, it doesn't tell us any details about, what elements of student satisfaction, what the outcomes of the survey were. Were they satisfied? Were they not satisfied? What did they like? What did they not like? So that's a case where more information is needed. Other things that we would recommend not doing are using things like enrollment or usage as an evaluation metric. It's great to document that, 100 students were enrolled in your class where previously you only had 30, but it's not giving you a measure of how the resource or the activity actually impacted those students. So it's great to have those numbers, but talk about the impact. What was it that brought more students into your classroom? What was their experience of whatever that might be? Also, don't encourage using dissemination as a metric. So in your closure report, simply writing something like, we found that students, or something like this, we conducted surveys to determine student satisfaction and presented them at X, Y, and Z conference. Fantastic. We strongly encourage dissemination of whatever you learn, but that's, again, not a metric of evaluation. You really need to talk about what the impact was and what you learned from the project. So a few examples of things that we would encourage, or ways to think about presenting your results. So in this example, in a Qualtrics survey, which gives information on the method that was used, on the new essay rubric, that's the practice that's happening, majority of the students reported that the new essay rubric helped them prepare for the final exam. So that's the outcome. It tells us what the impact of that rubric was. Another example, this is more common in the OER realm, where a key focus is really about reducing costs for students. That is a strong intended impact for projects funded in that way. So this new open text, which is the practice/resource in whatever course, saved students X amount of money. Another example here, TA focus groups revealed that students were not engaging in sharing their community-engaged learning experiences into the discussion boards. Students also suggested that the new self-study quizzes needed more examples. So this is an example, again, where the method, so how the information was obtained, what was happening, so the self-study quizzes, and what the outcomes were. So students were not engaging in it. Students wanted more examples. This is an example where things didn't go, super well. Things weren't all positive. That's still evaluation, and that's still really important to document. In no project that I've helped support would I ever encourage people to only focus on the positives. Again, evaluation is an iterative process. So learning about this type of experience and being able to say, students weren't really engaging in this. Okay, the next time you run this course, what can we do to help encourage more of that discussion? Okay, we need to build up more examples for these self-study quizzes. It's something that you've learned that helps you improve the project. That's really important to document. It means that you've learned something. That's the whole point of this whole process. So don't shy away from, saying like, things didn't go as I wanted. Students actually didn't really like this resource. That's fine. As long as you learned and you can improve and kind of make changes to your project moving forward, that's really the hope of all of this. So just as sort of an overview, focusing on explaining what practice took place, how the impacts were measured, so whatever method that you used, and what the outcome, what you learned from that evaluation. So next, Natasha and I are going to take a little break from talking, and we want to give some time to two project leads who, I believe Hassam's project is still active. Is that correct, Natasha? Yes. And Christine, her project ended, I believe, last year. And so we're just going to give them about 5 minutes each to share about their evaluation experience. And we hope this just encourages those of you who are in the process to kind of learn a little bit more about how evaluation can be helpful and what you can learn from it and sort of the ups and downs of that whole process. So Christine, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you to share your experiences.
No problem. Nice to see you. Hi, everybody. My name is Christine Clary, and I'm the Director of Student Services in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems here on the Vancouver campus. I'm actually joined today by a colleague, Thelini Layton, who is my TLEF grant winner, or sorry, we work on the project together and co-supervise the work. So really excited that Thelini's here today as well and can jump in with any additional comments. Just to give you a brief overview of the program that we wrapped up the TLEF funding for, but the program is ongoing because we were able to use the TLEF experience as a proof of concept to gain faculty support to continue the program and sustain it long term, which is really exciting. It's a program called ROOTS, which is an acronym for Reach Out, Orientation, Transition, and Study Skills, so a double S. And it's an online Canvas course, for lack of a better term, that we enroll all new students admitted into the faculty in every May, and can provide students with opportunities for social, academic, and professional learning and engagement, and supports them throughout their entire first year in the faculty. So we onboard them in May when they are newly admitted and offload them, as we're just doing with our cohort this year, at the end of their winter session experience, so in April of their first year in the faculty. And we have module releases of content on a weekly basis throughout the summer, as they need a lot of timely and helpful information. And then we also release content on a monthly basis from September to April, and we integrate things like workshops and surveys and reflection activities, and have used the ROOTS data to try and improve our metrics related to students having a stronger sense of belonging to the faculty, improved academic outcomes, and students having a stronger sense and awareness of the resources and supports available to them on campus. I cannot express how incredibly helpful Trish was in supporting us as a team, certainly in the early days of ROOTS. And even recently, we reached out to Trish to say, hey, by the by, we're now at this stage of our process. Would you be open to connecting with us and providing us with some additional support or feedback? So for those of you who are embarking upon this for the first time, if you are a super experienced researcher, you may not need to, but I encourage you to reach out to the resources available to you through TLEF. Congratulations on your projects, by the way. And for those of you who are newer to research and data collection and evaluation and assessment, I can't stress enough how important and critical it was for us to have a really great opportunity to engage with, learn from, and improve the ways in which we set out to assess our program. So we had opportunities to reflect on the kinds of questions we developed, for example, and Trish was really helpful in helping us to, kind of like that previous slide, it was kind of giving me a little bit of like wonderful PTSD in the sense of like, oh, I remember when we were learning about that, and kind of pushing and elevating our questions in ways that were really tied to what metrics we were looking to assess, and having an opportunity to refine those questions and build in assessment short term that we've now been able to implement and maintain long term as the program itself has evolved and our needs have potentially changed, and we're really excited by that. So in terms of the different kinds of assessment and evaluation pieces that we use, because we run ROOTS through the Canvas platform, we have access to the data that's available through ROOTS and all of the different data points that are collected, like the threads and the plugins, and we're tracking how students are engaging, when they're engaging, what they're engaging with, how frequently they're engaging with the content that we provide. We've done surveys and focus groups, and we've done a number of different activities. And I think, you know, your last point, Trish, really resonated with me in terms of highlighting not just the things that are great successes, but also the things where, you know, stuff that you were looking for didn't show up, or, and we definitely use those opportunities to refine the program annually to say, hey, this module isn't getting the same traction that we anticipated. Is it the timing of the module? Was it content that wasn't that great? So we've been able to like highlight those gaps or those opportunities where improvement could be made, and it's really helped advance our program. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. I know it's kind of a little bit of a speed round. Felina, I don't know if there's anything you want to jump in and add. But yeah, so we used a bunch of different survey designs and ways to gather that information and collate it together to help tell the root story. And I'm also sure we'll be happy to share with you that we were accepted as a conference proposal. So we're actually going to be talking about roots at a national advising conference in the spring, to be able to share a little bit more about what we've achieved and how we're achieving it. So we would not be able to be in a position to do that without your assistance and help. So we're really excited to carry this project forward and start sharing its story more broadly beyond our borders. So
thanks so much, Christine, and congratulations on presenting the work. That's really exciting. I think Christine's project is such a great story, and I really appreciate you bringing up that things didn't always go as intended, and that was okay. But with the TLEF and with any of these funds, what we really hope is that you do get funding for a small amount of time, but through the evaluation and that iterative process of building and getting momentum and getting people to buy into it, it can live past the 2 or 3 years that you have funding, and have these longer term impacts. So thanks so much, Christine, for your kind words and for sharing your experiences today. And with that, I'll pass it on to Hasem. I just want to make a note, I'm posting both of their TLEF pages in the chat in case you want to learn a little bit more about their projects. You're more than welcome to. So Hasem, please go ahead.
Yes. Hello, I'm Hassam. I'm Assistant Professor of Teaching Persian Language and Culture, Department of Asian Studies. Congratulations to everybody who won the TLEF. And I hope the best will happen to you. I just wanted to say that you are in good hands. I remember myself around the same time last year, and I haven't even started thinking about TLEF project when Trish talked about evaluation. I was freaking out. I said, "Oh my God, we haven't started yet, and then you're talking about evaluation. We are going to be evaluated." But it wasn't about evaluating me or the project. It was more about evaluating the effect of the work, and and the amount of I still can't do it again myself. This is all Natasha's help, and with her cooperative attitude and figuring out everything. She's so professional that she helped me figuring out the questions, how we should go about doing the surveys, what is the best way, and everything that I seriously had no idea how to do that. So we designed almost a course book as a supplementary course book for teaching literacy to beginner learners of Persian. It's an interactive multimedia Pressbooks, open resource on Pressbooks, which is still ongoing. But we received what I want to emphasize, that we received a huge amount of help from library. I didn't know what Pressbook is and how it works. They set up everything. You are absolutely in good hands, and don't worry about anything. If you are at all like me, naive and unexperienced, and you are worried, but yeah, and then in terms of training the TAs, in terms of how to go about doing everything along the way, I received wonderful support in this, and especially about the evaluation. It gives you an idea of how to measure the success and the shortcomings of your project, and to make it better. Now I have good evidence to show that what were the shortcomings and and to make them better, and what are the good parts and the strength of the project. Also, I'm now thinking about disseminating even now in terms of a subtle project or something like that. It's a completely separate project, but this thinking alongside these lines, and with the help of Natasha and the evaluation team, I think we have good findings now, and we can disseminate as well. Oh, we are talking about this in we have a poster and everything in Celebrate Learning Week in that we talk about everything. I have the poster. I just don't want to share it now with you. Just come to the Celebrate Learning Week and we explain everything about it. I have a special section about survey and the results too there. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam. I'll post a link to the TLEF showcase in the chat in case people are interested. This is something that is encouraged of all TLEF holders. And for those of you with SAP funds, grants, or OER grants, there are also avenues for sharing your work. But the TLEF showcase is a great place to kind of, learn about what other projects are doing and what's going on there. I'll just post a link to that in the chat. It's coming up in 2 weeks, so you still have time to register. With that, I'm just going to share 2 final slides, which are just some resource slides. So a number of web resources are available alongside the support from Natasha and myself. If you're kind of like, oh, I think I know enough about this, but I just need a little bit of help deciding X, Y, or Z. Some wonderful websites to give you information. We will share the slides in the recording with all participants, so you'll have access to all of these links to look back on whenever you're ready. And I also wanted to point out, thank you, Hassem, for bringing up the idea of, mentioning the library and the other resources that are available. Natasha and I are here to support you from the evaluation side. For different types of projects, there are evaluation consultants that are in the lead. You're always welcome to reach out to one of us. But for SAP fund projects, Marissa specifically is assigned to the evaluation side of that. And if you have an OER fund or you're thinking about applying for an OER fund project, Will is our strategist who kind of handles all of those elements. Within CTLT, we also have faculty liaisons. So if you're in one of these faculties, you're welcome to reach out to those people who'd be able to help point you to places like libraries or library resources or other folks who can certainly help move your project along, not just within evaluation, but beyond as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will stop the recording. And